What's the most drastic thing that one family member did because a shaman told them to? My boyfriend Austin and I were out celebrating our 3-year anniversary when my cousin Catelyn showed up unannounced, yelling, "You need to break up with him! Austin's mine!" She slammed her phone down between our ceramic plates with her Etsy page open. "A witch just did my love reading. She says I'm destined to be with a Capricorn." She turned to Austin. "You're the Capricorn. The universe wants you for me." By the time I could ask her which insane asylum she'd just broken out of, she'd already grabbed Austin's shoulder and was leaning in to try to force a kiss on his lips. He quickly stood up from the table and pushed her away. "You already tried this last year and I said no. Why are you back?" She frowned and asked, "But this time it's cosmic destiny." Then she turned to me with the most serious expression and said, "You have 1 week to break up with him, or I'll use the energy of the zodiac and take divine action myself." My auntie called me 3 days later worried about Catelyn and asked us to come over and talk some sense into her. She had turned the living room into a spiritual war room with astrological charts printed and taped to every wall. When she saw us enter, she grinned and turned our attention to the TV, showing the face of the Etsy psychic. This time the witch was delivering her readings through a live video call. She explained how Austin and Catelyn's birth charts were cosmic twins, and that I was a spiritual blockage preventing true love. After several more minutes of nonsense, my dad finally asked, "So what exactly are you expecting to happen here?" She smiled. "They just need to break up immediately, before the universe punishes our entire family," she said casually, like it was the most obvious thing. Austin shook his head and told her very clearly that he loved me and had zero interest in ever being with Catelyn. "Even if for some reason we broke up tomorrow, I still wouldn't date you," he stated. That's when Catelyn started screaming, "If you don't break up now, you'll face cosmic wrath." We shrugged. "I guess that's what we'll do then." She stormed into her bedroom, leaving the whole family sitting there embarrassed for her. Then she went silent. For 2 months, we didn't hear from her until one morning when I walked out to get my mail. I saw Catelyn carrying boxes into the apartment next door. "Surprise neighbor," she said with this huge smile. "The universe is so amazing because this apartment became available right when I needed it." That's when the nightmare really started. She'd show up everywhere me and Austin went. Dinner, movies, even on a hiking trail 40 minutes outside town. But then one day, things took a turn when Austin called me completely panicked, asking me to come home ASAP. Apparently, Catelyn used the spare key under our mat and crawled in next to him while Austin was sleeping. He woke up screaming and quickly dragged her out the door while she tried to fight back, saying it was the universe that let her in. Austin was so freaked out he couldn't sleep for days. So we decided to finally move out. We'd rented a U-Haul and loaded it at 4 in the morning thinking Catelyn would still be asleep. We were wrong. As soon as we pulled onto the highway, I saw her car chasing us. Austin tried to stay calm, but she drove recklessly, swerving into the lane beside us going almost 90. She pulled up alongside the truck and started yelling out her window, "The witch promised me a Capricorn. She promised me true love." Then she tried ramming the side of the U-Haul to force us to pull over. But on her third attempt, Austin quickly hit the gas to dodge her car, which made her spin across 3 lanes, flipping twice before slamming into a concrete barrier. We pulled over immediately and called 911. The paramedic said she was lucky to be alive, considering her spine was practically crushed in 2 places. She had emergency surgery that night, and the doctors confirmed she'd be paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of her life. The first thing Catelyn did when she woke up from surgery was post on social media about how, "The witch told me he was my Capricorn. I just wanted a chance at love. I didn't want to hurt like this. I'll never walk down the aisle now. I can't believe my cousin took my soulmate and my legs." The worst part was that because of the tragedy, people started sympathizing with her. My aunt commented that we should have just let her follow us peacefully instead of trying to escape. My mom said we knew how much the reading meant to her and could have handled things differently. Even some of my cousins were saying that we should have just moved without telling her instead of doing it in front of her apartment where she'd obviously see us. Austin and I finished moving into our new home, but we couldn't enjoy the peace and quiet at all. The part that hurt me the most was how guilty Austin felt about Catelyn's paralysis. He started visiting her every day in the hospital, just to check if she was okay. Then he started staying there longer and longer, coming home late, sometimes not coming home at all. And a part of me started to wonder if the Etsy witch was right. I couldn't sleep that night. Austin was right next to me in bed, but I kept staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. Every time he shifted or made a noise, I jumped. My brain kept going back to that stupid Etsy witch saying Austin and Catelyn were cosmic twins. I hated myself for even thinking about it. The moving boxes were still stacked against the walls because we hadn't finished unpacking yet. They made the room feel smaller, like they were pushing in on me. I watched Austin's chest rise and fall while he slept. He looked so peaceful, but I knew when he woke up he'd check his phone first thing. That's what he always did now. I finally dozed off around 5 in the morning, but woke up an hour later when Austin's phone started buzzing. He grabbed it immediately and his whole face changed. I watched him scroll through 3 text messages, his expression getting more worried with each one. He sat up in bed and rubbed his face. "Catelyn had a bad night," he said quietly. "The nurses think she needs someone familiar there to calm her down." I felt my stomach twist. Please don't go, I said. He looked at me and I could see the conflict all over his face. That look made me want to throw up. I have to, he said. Just for a little while. But I knew it wouldn't be a little while. It never was anymore. We had our first real screaming fight that morning. I told him he'd spent 4 nights at the hospital this week and only 3 nights in our new home. We just moved here to get away from her and now you're choosing to be with her anyway, I shouted. Austin got defensive immediately. Catelyn doesn't have anyone else. Her mom can't even look at her in that wheelchair without breaking down, he yelled back. I asked him when this was going to end. He promised it was temporary, just until she adjusted to her new reality. But the way he said it sounded hollow. I didn't believe him anymore. I couldn't. He grabbed his keys and left for the hospital while I stood there in our half-unpacked apartment feeling like my world was falling apart. After the door slammed, I sat down on the floor surrounded by boxes and just stared at nothing for a while. Then I got up and found a notebook. I needed to see this whole thing clearly instead of drowning in guilt and confusion. I started writing down everything that happened since our anniversary dinner. The date Catelyn showed up at the restaurant, the day she moved in next door, every time she followed us to random places, the break-in where she crawled into bed with Austin, the highway chase. I wrote down times and dates for everything I could remember. I took screenshots of her social media posts and printed them out. I found photos on my phone of her car behind us at that hiking trail. When I finished, I had a timeline that showed clear stalking behavior that kept getting worse. Looking at it all laid out on paper, I realized something important. We weren't the villains my family thought we were. Catelyn had been stalking us for months, and it led to her making a reckless choice to chase us at 90 miles per hour. Seeing it documented like this made me feel less crazy. I picked up my phone and called the non-emergency police line. My hands were shaking when someone answered. I asked if I could report stalking that happened before an accident. The operator put me on hold for a few minutes, then transferred me to someone named Detective Nadia Palermo. She said she worked on domestic crimes and harassment cases. I told her the whole story from start to finish. She listened without interrupting once, which surprised me. When I finished, she said something that made me want to cry with relief. The fact that your cousin is paralyzed now doesn't erase the criminal behavior that came before, Detective Palermo explained. She asked me to come to the police station with my documentation and any evidence I still had. I told her I'd just spent the morning putting it all together. She scheduled me for an appointment 2 days later. At the police station, I spread out my timeline, screenshots, and photos across Detective Palermo's desk. She was probably in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She took notes while looking through everything. Stalking cases are difficult, she said. But this documentation is exactly what we need. She explained that the crash made things complicated because juries feel sorry for disabled victims. But she kept coming back to my timeline. The pattern of behavior before the accident is clear harassment, Detective Palermo said. Then she asked about Austin. I admitted he'd been visiting Catelyn every day at the hospital for weeks. The detective's expression changed. She looked concerned. His visits could be seen as reconciliation or forgiveness, she explained carefully. That might hurt any harassment case we try to build. My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about that. Austin's guilt was actively destroying our legal options. Austin came home that night around 9. He smelled like hospital antiseptic and hand sanitizer. I was sitting on the couch waiting for him. I met with a detective today, I said. His face went pale. I told him everything Detective Palermo said about his hospital visits, how they could be interpreted as him forgiving Catelyn, how that undermined any legal case against her. Austin got defensive immediately. So you're asking me to abandon someone who's paralyzed because of us? He said loudly. I stood up and looked him in the eye. She's paralyzed because she chose to chase us at 90 miles per hour, I said sharply. That was her choice, not ours. His face went even paler. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. He just stood there looking lost. The next morning, my phone rang while Austin was in the shower. A woman introduced herself as Kalani Floyd, a social worker at the hospital. She said she was part of Catelyn's care team. We've noticed Austin spending a lot of time here, Kalani said gently, including staying overnight in Catelyn's room. My heart started pounding. We're concerned about appropriate boundaries, she continued. Are you aware of how much time he's been spending at the hospital? I felt like I couldn't breathe. How much time? I asked. Kalani paused. He's been staying overnight 3 to 4 nights a week for the past month. I thanked her and hung up. Austin had been lying to me. Not just a little. He'd been lying about the whole extent of his visits. When Austin got out of the shower, I was standing in the bedroom holding my phone. A social worker named Kalani just called me, I said. I watched his face change. He knew he was caught. She told me you've been sleeping in a chair next to Catelyn's bed 3 or 4 nights a week. Austin's eyes filled with tears. He sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands. I can't stop seeing her car flip across the highway, he said, crying. I keep thinking if I hadn't hit the gas, she wouldn't be paralyzed. He was sobbing now. I feel like I caused this. I stood there feeling 2 things at once. Part of me wanted to comfort him because he was clearly suffering, but another part of me felt completely betrayed. He'd been lying to me for weeks. I didn't know which feeling was stronger. That night we barely slept in the same room. I stayed on my side of the bed, staring at the ceiling while Austin tossed and turned next to me. Around 3 in the morning, I finally said what I'd been holding in for hours. "You've been lying to me for weeks." My voice came out flat and cold. Austin sat up and turned on the lamp. "I wasn't trying to lie," he started, but I cut him off. "You told me you were visiting for an hour or two," I said, my voice getting louder. "Kalani said you've been sleeping there 3 or 4 nights a week. That's not visiting. That's choosing her over me." Austin's face went red and he stood up from the bed. "You don't understand the guilt I'm carrying," he yelled back. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her car flipping across the highway. I see her body getting pulled from the wreckage. Watching someone become paralyzed because of something you did changes you." I jumped out of bed and faced him. "Because of something she did," I shouted. "Catelyn chose to chase us at 90 miles per hour. She chose to ram our truck. She chose to drive like a maniac. We didn't cause this. She did." Austin shook his head like I didn't get it. "If I hadn't hit the gas, she wouldn't have spun out," he said. "I made a split-second choice, and now she'll never walk again." I felt something break inside me. "So what's your plan then?" I asked. "You're just going to keep sleeping in her hospital room forever? You're going to throw away our relationship because you feel guilty? Is that what you want?" He didn't answer right away, and that silence hurt worse than anything he could have said. "I don't know what I want anymore," he finally admitted. "I just know I can't abandon her when she's lying there paralyzed." I grabbed my pillow and a blanket from the closet. "Then you can sleep on the couch tonight," I said. "Because I'm not sharing a bed with someone who's choosing his stalker over his girlfriend." Austin's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't argue. He just took the pillow and blanket and walked out of the bedroom. I locked the door behind him and cried myself to sleep. The next morning, Austin's phone started ringing at 6 in the morning. I heard it from the bedroom even though the door was closed. I got up and pressed my ear against the door to listen. "Yes, this is Austin," I heard him say. Then there was a long pause. "I know, I'm really sorry about that. We've had some family emergencies." Another pause. "Personal issues, yes. It won't happen again." I opened the bedroom door quietly and watched him sitting on the couch with his head in one hand and the phone in the other. "I understand. Thank you for calling. I'll be there on time from now on." He hung up and just sat there staring at the floor. I walked into the living room and he looked up at me with exhausted eyes. "That was my boss," he said quietly. "He wanted to know why I've missed 3 morning meetings this month." I sat down on the chair across from him. "What did you tell him?" Austin rubbed his face with both hands. I made excuses about family emergencies and personal issues. He didn't sound convinced. He put his phone down on the coffee table and leaned back against the couch. "I think I'm in trouble at work." I watched him sitting there looking defeated and realized this wasn't just destroying our relationship. His guilt over Catelyn was destroying his entire life. His career was falling apart. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and I didn't know how to help him anymore. That afternoon, while Austin was at work, I searched online for therapists who specialized in trauma and relationship issues. I found a woman named Imogen Bracken who had good reviews and availability. I called her office and booked an appointment for the next day before I could change my mind. The receptionist asked if I wanted to schedule couples therapy, and I said no, just individual for now. When I showed up to Imogen's office the next afternoon, she was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 30s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She invited me to sit on a comfortable chair in her office and asked me to tell her what brought me in. I started talking and couldn't stop. I told her everything from the anniversary dinner to Catelyn moving in next door to the highway chase to Austin sleeping at the hospital. By the time I got to the part about wondering if the psychic was right, I was crying. "I know it sounds crazy," I said, wiping my eyes with a tissue. "But what if the universe really does want them together? What if I'm the one standing in the way of his actual destiny?" Imogen leaned forward slightly. "Do you really believe in cosmic destiny?" she asked gently. "Or are you looking for an explanation that makes this situation less painful?" I thought about that for a minute. "I don't know what I believe anymore," I admitted. "I just know that Austin is choosing to be with her instead of me, and maybe there's a reason for that." Imogen spent the next 20 minutes helping me see that Austin's guilt response was a psychological pattern, not proof of cosmic destiny. She explained how trauma can make people act in ways that don't match their actual feelings or desires. "Your boyfriend is experiencing what we call survivor's guilt," she explained. "He feels responsible for Catelyn's paralysis even though her reckless driving caused the accident. That guilt is driving his behavior right now, not romantic feelings or universal forces." By the end of the session, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. The psychic wasn't right. Austin wasn't cosmically destined to be with Catelyn. He was just a person struggling with trauma and making bad choices because of it. 2 days later, Detective Palermo called my phone while I was making dinner. "I've been reviewing Catelyn's social media accounts," she said, "and I found some concerning posts from before the crash." She told me there were photos of our old apartment building posted weeks before Catelyn moved in next door. Screenshots of Austin's work schedule that she must have figured out by watching us. Captions about signs from the universe guiding her to us. "This is clear evidence of premeditated stalking behavior," the detective explained. "It significantly strengthens the harassment case." I felt relieved that someone official was finally seeing what we'd been dealing with. "What happens next?" I asked. Detective Palermo said she needed to interview Austin about his current relationship with Catelyn. His hospital visits are going to come up in any legal proceedings, she warned. I need to understand the full picture before we move forward. I told her I'd talk to Austin about scheduling an interview. After I hung up, I realized this was going to force another difficult conversation with him about the hospital visits. That night, I told Austin about the detective's call and said we needed to meet with her together. He looked uncomfortable, but didn't say no right away. I don't know if I want to pursue legal action against Catelyn when she's paralyzed, he said. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. If you don't take this seriously, I'm moving out, I said. I can't keep living like this. Austin's face went pale. You'd actually leave? He asked. Yes, I said. Because I deserve a partner who puts our relationship first, not someone who's more committed to his stalker than his girlfriend. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. Okay, I'll go to the meeting with the detective. I scheduled the appointment for the following week and hoped this would finally make Austin understand how serious everything had become. At the police station, Detective Palermo sat us down in a small conference room and pulled out a folder full of printed documents. She walked Austin through how his hospital visits would look to law enforcement and potential juries. When a stalking victim spends significant time with their stalker after a traumatic incident, it can appear that they've forgiven the behavior, she explained. That makes it nearly impossible to prosecute harassment charges, because the defense will argue that the victim didn't feel truly threatened. Austin looked shocked. But I'm only visiting because I feel guilty about the accident, he said. Detective Palermo nodded. I understand that. But a jury won't see your internal motivations. They'll see that you're voluntarily spending time with someone who stalked you, broke into your home, and chased you on the highway. That undermines the claim that you felt unsafe. I watched Austin's face as he processed what she was saying. So by trying to help Catelyn, I'm making it impossible to protect ourselves legally? He asked quietly. Unfortunately, yes, the detective confirmed. She spent another 30 minutes explaining how his behavior was affecting our case and what that meant for our safety going forward. When we left the police station, Austin was quiet for the entire drive home. Once we got inside, he sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. I've been operating from guilt instead of clear thinking, he said. I thought I was doing the right thing by being there for Catelyn, but I've been making everything worse. I sat down next to him and waited for him to continue. The detective is right, he said. I need to step back and let the professionals handle Catelyn's care. Detective Palermo had suggested we consult with a civil attorney about protective orders and defamation, since Catelyn's social media posts were painting us as villains. She gave us a referral to a lawyer named Maddie Winters, who handled harassment and online defamation cases. Austin agreed to call her office the next day to schedule a meeting. The following week, we met with Maddie Winters at her law office downtown. She was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She pulled up Catelyn's social media on her computer and read through the posts out loud. The witch told me he was my Capricorn. I just wanted a chance at love. I can't believe my cousin took my soulmate and my legs. Maddie looked at us over her computer screen. This is textbook defamation. She's making false claims that paint you as responsible for her injuries when her own reckless driving caused the accident. She explained that we could pursue defamation claims and request a protective order that would legally prohibit Catelyn from contacting us or posting about us online. However, legal action is expensive and outcomes are never guaranteed, she warned. I'd need $5,000 just for the initial filings, court fees, and preliminary work. Austin and I exchanged worried looks. We didn't have that kind of money just sitting around. Our savings had taken a hit from the move, and we were barely covering rent and bills. Can we think about it? I asked. Maddie nodded and gave us her card. Take your time, but don't wait too long. The longer those defamatory posts stay up, the more damage they do to your reputations. 3 days later, Austin came home from work looking shaken. His face was pale, and he dropped his keys on the counter with trembling hands. My boss called me into his office today, he said. I felt my stomach drop. What happened? Austin sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. I've been placed on a performance improvement plan. 60 days to fix my tardiness, stop missing meetings, and improve my work quality. If I don't meet the standards, I'm fired. I sat down across from him. What does that mean for us? I asked quietly. It means if I lose my job, we lose our health insurance, he said. And we'll struggle to pay rent. I can't afford to mess this up. I watched him sitting there looking defeated, and realized the financial pressure might be the thing that finally broke through his guilt fog. He couldn't keep visiting Catelyn multiple times a week if it meant losing his job and our ability to survive. That night, Austin and I sat down together at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. I can't keep visiting Catelyn the way I have been, he admitted. It's destroying my job, our relationship, and my mental health. We created a realistic visiting schedule together. Once a week for 1 hour maximum. No overnight stays. No responding to every crisis call from the nurses. I need to tell Kalani about these new boundaries, Austin said. She needs to know I'm stepping back from being so involved in Catelyn's care. I felt a tiny bit of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe we could actually survive this if Austin was finally willing to set real limits. He called the hospital the next morning and left a message for Kalani, explaining the new visiting schedule and asking her to document it in Catelyn's care plan. While Austin was at work that afternoon, I decided to message the Etsy psychic directly. I created a fake account and sent Harlow Middle a message saying I was interested in a reading. She responded within an hour with a price list. $50 for a basic reading, $200 for a detailed birth chart analysis, $500 for a deep soul connection analysis. I mentioned that my cousin had used her services and had a really powerful experience. Harlow sent back a generic message about cosmic timing and offered me a 20% discount on my first reading. The whole interaction made it clear this was just a business to her. She probably didn't even remember Catelyn specifically. She was just running through her standard sales pitch with anyone who messaged her. I screenshot the entire conversation and saved it to my phone. I didn't know if it would be useful for anything legal, but I wanted documentation of how she operated. This woman had fed my cousin's delusion for profit, and I wanted proof of what she was really about. I opened my email and attached the screenshots of my conversation with Harlow to a message for Detective Palermo. The psychic's price list and generic responses made it obvious this was just a sales operation to her. I hit send and waited. The detective called me back 2 hours later and told me the screenshots were useful context, but giving fake psychic readings wasn't actually illegal. She explained that unless we could prove Harlow specifically told Catelyn to stalk us or break into our apartment, there was no crime we could charge her with. I sat there holding my phone feeling completely frustrated that this woman had profited from feeding my cousin's delusion, and there was nothing we could do about it. The detective said she'd keep the evidence on file in case Harlow contacted us directly, but otherwise her hands were tied. I thanked her and hung up, then stared at those screenshots on my phone for another 10 minutes, wishing there was some way to hold Harlow accountable. Austin came home from work the next day looking relieved instead of stressed for the first time in weeks. He sat down at the kitchen table and told me his meeting with Lars went better than expected. His HR manager had been surprisingly understanding about the whole situation. Lars told him that personal crises happen to everyone, but the company needed employees they could count on. He suggested Austin use their employee assistance program to get some counseling. The best part was that Lars agreed to let Austin modify his schedule so he could work earlier hours in the morning and have more flexibility in the afternoon without hurting his work quality. Austin pulled out the paperwork showing his new schedule starting Monday, and I could see the tension leaving his shoulders. He still had to meet the performance improvement plan standards, but at least now he had a path forward that didn't require choosing between his job and dealing with everything happening with Catelyn. My phone started buzzing constantly the next afternoon with notifications from the family group chat. I opened it to see my aunt had posted a long message about how we all needed to contribute money to Catelyn's medical bills, because family takes care of family. Several of my cousins immediately jumped in agreeing with her. My mom commented that medical debt could ruin Catelyn's life before it even got started again. One uncle suggested we set up a payment plan where everyone contributes $50 a month. Then the messages started getting more pointed, with relatives saying things like, "Some people caused this situation and should take responsibility." My aunt posted that if certain family members hadn't tried to run away from Catelyn on the highway, none of this would have happened. I watched the messages pile up for about 20 minutes before I'd had enough. I left the group chat and sent individual texts to my mom and dad saying I needed space from family drama while Austin and I dealt with legal issues and work problems. My mom responded with a sad face emoji. My dad sent back a simple, "Okay." I made an appointment with Imogen for my first official therapy session the following week. Sitting in her office felt different from our initial consultation, because now I was committing to regular weekly sessions. She asked me to describe what I was struggling with most, and I started crying before I even finished explaining. I told her about the complicated grief of watching my cousin become paralyzed, while also knowing she'd been dangerous and obsessive. Imogen listened without interrupting, and then said something that made me feel like someone finally understood. She told me I could feel sad about Catelyn's condition, while still protecting myself from her behavior. Those two things weren't opposites. She explained that grief is complicated, and I didn't have to choose between feeling guilty or feeling angry. I could feel both, and neither emotion made me a bad person. We spent the rest of the session working on tools for managing the anxiety that woke me up at 3 in the morning. By the time I left her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Detective Palermo called me 3 days later with news that made my hands shake. She'd recovered security footage from our old apartment building showing Catelyn attempting to enter our unit multiple times before the break-in, where Austin woke up with her next to him. The footage showed her trying different keys at our door and checking our windows on at least 4 separate occasions over 2 weeks. The detective explained this proved premeditation and showed escalating behavior leading up to the actual break-in. She said this evidence could support both criminal harassment charges and a civil protective order. I asked her what our next steps should be, and she told me to contact our attorney about filing for the protective order while she continued building the criminal case. After we hung up, I sat on the couch replaying what she'd said about Catelyn checking our windows. The thought of her standing outside our apartment watching us made my skin crawl. Maddie called me the next morning saying she'd started drafting a protective order request based on the evidence Detective Palermo sent over. The order would legally prohibit Catelyn from contacting us, posting about us online, or coming within 500 feet of our home or workplaces. She explained that both Austin and I needed to sign affidavits detailing the stalking behavior and how it had emotionally harmed us. I told her I'd sign immediately, and she emailed the paperwork over. That night, I showed Austin the documents and watched his face change as he read through them. He set the papers down and said he needed time to think about whether this was too harsh given Catelyn's current condition. I felt my stomach drop because I thought we were past this guilt phase. He asked if we could talk about it over the weekend, and I agreed, even though I wanted to scream at him that Catelyn being paralyzed didn't erase what she'd done to us. My cousin Miguel called me out of nowhere 2 days later. We'd never been super close, but he'd always been nice at family gatherings. He asked if I had a minute to talk, and I said sure. That's when he told me something that made me sit down hard on the couch. My aunt had been listed as Catelyn's primary support person at the hospital, which made sense. But somehow she'd also added Austin as a secondary contact without asking him or telling us. Miguel said he'd overheard his mom talking to the hospital about it. Before I could process what that meant, my phone rang with a call from Kalani Floyd. The social worker explained that she was calling to clarify Austin's contact status because something seemed off in the records. I told her Austin never consented to being listed as any kind of contact for Catelyn's care. Kalani apologized and said she'd remove him immediately and document this as a boundary violation in the hospital records. After both calls ended, I texted Austin at work, telling him we needed to talk as soon as he got home. Austin came through the door that evening, and I showed him the protective order paperwork again. We sat at the kitchen table and had the calmest but most serious conversation we'd had in weeks. He finally admitted that his hesitation about the order came from fear that we'd look like monsters kicking someone while they're down. I took a deep breath and reminded him that Catelyn created this situation by stalking us and driving recklessly on the highway. Protecting ourselves legally didn't make us bad people. He nodded slowly and said he knew I was right, but the guilt still felt overwhelming sometimes. I told him that was exactly why we both needed to keep going to therapy. He picked up the pen and signed his name on the affidavit. We returned the completed paperwork to Maddie the next morning, and she said she'd file it with the court by the end of the week. I was scrolling through social media a few days later when I saw Catelyn's GoFundMe page had been shared by someone I'd gone to high school with. I clicked on it and felt sick reading what she'd written. She framed herself as a heartbroken woman whose cousin stole her soulmate and whose life was destroyed in a tragic accident. The comments section was full of strangers calling me selfish and cruel. People were saying I should be ashamed of myself for not supporting her. Someone commented that I probably caused the crash on purpose. Within an hour, several people had tracked down my social media accounts and started sending me harassing messages. I made all my profiles private and blocked dozens of accounts, but the damage was done. I felt violated all over again by people who knew nothing about what actually happened. Austin found me crying in the bedroom and held me while I told him about the GoFundMe. He looked at the page on his phone and his face went pale reading the comments. Miguel called me again the next evening and started by apologizing for not reaching out sooner. Then he dropped information that made me grip my phone harder. He said my aunt had actually paid Harlow the psychic over $2,000 for multiple readings over a 6-month period. The aunt had been encouraging Catelyn's delusion the whole time because she wanted her daughter to find love and didn't take the cosmic destiny thing seriously until everything went wrong. Miguel said his mom felt terrible now but was too proud to admit it to anyone. I sat there processing this and felt a complicated mix of anger at my aunt for enabling everything and slight empathy for her regret. I thanked Miguel for telling me and asked him not to mention to anyone that we'd talked. He agreed and said he just wanted me to know the truth about what had been happening behind the scenes. I sat there holding my phone after Miguel hung up, feeling this weird mix of anger and something else I couldn't name. $2,000. My aunt had spent $2,000 feeding Catelyn's crazy ideas about cosmic destiny while pretending to be worried about her mental health. I wanted to scream or throw something, but instead I just sat on the couch staring at the wall until I heard Austin's key in the door 3 hours earlier than usual. He walked in looking completely destroyed, eyes red and puffy, and I knew something bad had happened before he even opened his mouth. He dropped his bag by the door and came straight to me, sitting down hard on the couch like his legs couldn't hold him anymore. He told me he'd stayed overnight at the hospital again last week when the nurses called about Catelyn having a panic attack. The words came out broken between these awful crying sounds that made my chest hurt. He said he knew he'd broken our agreement, but when the nurses called saying Catelyn was asking for him and wouldn't calm down, he couldn't just ignore it. I felt this hot surge of anger rush through me because we'd made that agreement for a reason. But then I looked at his face and saw he was being completely honest with me for the first time in weeks. He wasn't hiding it or making excuses. He was just telling me the truth even though it hurt. I reached over and put my hand on his arm and told him I was mad, but I also saw that he was trying, and that honesty mattered more than the mistake. He cried harder and said he didn't know how to stop feeling responsible for destroying someone's life. I made us both tea, and we sat there not talking for a long time, just existing in the same space while he pulled himself together. 2 days later, I had my regular therapy session with Imogen, and the first thing she asked was how I was doing with family pressure. I told her about Miguel's call and the $2,000 and Austin's hospital confession, and she listened without interrupting until I ran out of words. Then she pulled out a notebook and suggested we write a boundary letter together. Something clear and direct that I could send to my family about what contact I would and wouldn't accept during all this legal stuff. We spent 40 minutes working on it, with Imogen helping me find words that were firm but not mean. The letter said I loved my family, but I wouldn't accept any more blame or guilt trips about Catelyn's condition, that Austin and I were protecting ourselves legally, and that was our right, and that anyone who couldn't respect our boundaries needed to keep their distance until they could. Reading it back made me feel powerful in a way I hadn't felt since the crash. After the session, I went home and typed it up, then sent it to my parents, my aunt, and 3 cousins I was closest to before everything went wrong. The responses started coming in within hours. My dad sent back a short text saying he understood and respected my decision. One cousin wrote this long message about how she'd been worried about Catelyn's behavior too, and wished she'd said something earlier. But my mom's response was cold, just saying she hoped I knew what I was doing by pushing family away. My aunt didn't respond at all, which somehow felt worse than anger. 3 nights later, I was already asleep when Austin's phone started ringing at almost midnight. I jolted awake and saw him grab it off the nightstand, his face going pale in the screen light. He answered, and I heard my aunt's voice coming through, high and panicked, talking so fast I couldn't make out the words. Austin sat up, and I watched his whole body tense as he listened. His hand started shaking, and he looked over at me with this expression that was pure panic, like he was drowning and asking me to save him. My aunt was begging him to come to the hospital right now because Catelyn was having some kind of crisis, and kept asking for him, and the nurses didn't know what to do. I could see him wanting to say yes, wanting to jump up and drive over there because that's what he'd been doing for months. But instead, he took this deep breath and said into the phone that he couldn't come, that my aunt needed to call the hospital's crisis line because that's what they were trained for. My aunt started arguing, and I heard her voice get louder, but Austin just repeated himself and then hung up. He sat there holding the phone with both hands, shaking so hard the whole bed moved. I pulled him against me and wrapped my arms around him while he cried into my shoulder. He kept saying he felt like a terrible person for not going, that Catelyn was suffering and he was just sitting here. I told him over and over that he'd made the right choice, that going would only make everything worse, that he couldn't save Catelyn by destroying himself. We stayed like that for over an hour until he finally stopped shaking and fell asleep against me. I stayed awake most of the night thinking about how hard that phone call must have been for him, and feeling grateful he'd chosen us instead of his guilt. The next afternoon, Austin was scrolling through his phone when he suddenly went completely still. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then got up and walked over to where I was making lunch. He showed me a direct message from Harlow, the Etsy psychic who'd started this whole nightmare. The message said the universe was trying to bring him and Catelyn together, and he needed to fulfill his cosmic destiny before it was too late, that fighting against the stars would only bring more pain. I felt my hands clench into fists reading that garbage. Austin didn't say anything, just opened his phone settings and took a screenshot of the entire conversation. Then he blocked Harlow's account and immediately opened his email to send the screenshot to both Detective Palermo and Maddie. He typed out a quick message explaining what had happened and hit send on both emails. I watched him do all of this with this calm efficiency that made me proud of him. This was proof that the psychic was still actively pushing Catelyn's delusion, even after she'd ended up paralyzed, still trying to manipulate Austin into some fake cosmic relationship. Detective Palermo responded within an hour saying this was excellent evidence of ongoing harassment and she'd add it to our case file. Maddie wrote back saying this strengthened our position significantly because it showed a pattern of third-party interference. We scheduled a meeting with Maddie for the following Monday and sat in her office going over every detail of the protective order paperwork. She explained exactly what the order would and wouldn't do, the limitations and the protections. Austin and I both signed our names on multiple affidavits describing the stalking behavior and the emotional damage it had caused. Maddie pulled out a payment form and told us the filing fees would be $800 from our emergency savings account, money we'd been keeping for exactly this kind of situation, but it still hurt to spend it. She said the court date was set for 3 weeks out, and we'd need to appear in person to testify about why we needed the order. Walking out of her office into the bright afternoon sun, I felt this strange combination of scared and relieved. Scared because we were making everything official and legal and there was no going back. Relieved because we were finally taking real action, instead of just reacting to whatever Catelyn or my family did next. Austin reached over and took my hand as we walked to the car, and I squeezed back hard. That night, I was checking my email before bed when I saw a new message from my aunt with the subject line, "Legal action." My stomach dropped as I opened it, and started reading this long, rambling message about emotional abuse and how we were preventing her from supporting her disabled daughter. She threatened to sue us for causing Catelyn's condition through our reckless driving, and for the ongoing emotional distress we were causing the whole family. The email went on for 3 pages, getting more and more angry and less coherent. I forwarded it to Maddie immediately with shaking hands. She called me the next morning, and I could hear the eye roll in her voice as she told me my aunt had absolutely no legal grounds for any lawsuit. This was just an intimidation tactic, trying to scare us into dropping the protective order. Maddie said she'd send a formal cease and desist letter to my aunt explaining that further threats would be considered harassment. When I hung up, I felt this weird mix of empowered and sad. Empowered because we had legal protection, but sad because my aunt had gotten so twisted up in this that she was threatening to sue her own niece. Detective Palermo called 2 days later with an update that made me sit down hard in the kitchen chair. She'd finished interviewing neighbors from our old apartment building, and 3 people had provided written statements about seeing Catelyn watching our place at odd hours. One neighbor specifically remembered Catelyn stopping her in the parking lot and asking questions about our schedule, what time we usually left for work, which car was ours. Another neighbor had seen Catelyn sitting in her car outside our building at 2 in the morning multiple times. The detective said these statements were huge because they proved a clear pattern of surveillance and stalking behavior before the break-in. This wasn't just my word against Catelyn's anymore. We had outside witnesses who'd seen her obsessive behavior and could testify about it. The harassment case was getting stronger with every piece of evidence we collected. Austin came home from work that Friday, looking lighter than I'd seen him in months. He told me he'd just had his performance improvement plan review with Lars, and his performance had improved enough to continue employment. Lars had told him the new schedule was working well, coming in earlier and not taking long lunch breaks anymore. Austin looked exhausted from the new routine, getting up at 5:30 every morning to be at work by 7, but his job was secure and that removed this huge weight we'd been carrying. We wouldn't lose our health insurance or struggle to pay rent. One major stressor was actually gone. We ordered pizza that night to celebrate, and Austin fell asleep on the couch at 8:30, completely wiped out, but safe. The following Tuesday, Kalani called to tell us about a care team meeting the hospital had held about Catelyn's recovery plan. The social worker explained that after reviewing Austin's involvement and the boundary violations that had happened, she was formally implementing contact restrictions that removed Austin from the approved visitor list. My aunt had apparently shown up at the meeting and tried to fight the decision, arguing that Austin was important to Catelyn's recovery. But Kalani had stood firm and explained that healthy boundaries were actually part of recovery, not obstacles to it. Austin would receive official notification that he was no longer permitted to visit without explicit approval from Catelyn's medical team. When Austin got the letter in the mail 3 days later, I watched him read it twice before folding it carefully and putting it in our legal documents folder. He looked relieved and sad at the same time. Then Catelyn posted something on social media that made my blood run cold. Someone sent me a screenshot because I'd blocked her months ago. She'd uploaded edited audio clips that she claimed were from private conversations with Austin, little snippets of him saying things like, "I care about you," and "I want you to be okay," that made it sound like he had feelings for her. But I knew exactly what those clips were from: his hospital visits where he'd been trying to comfort her as a decent human being. She'd recorded him without his knowledge, and now she was cutting up the recordings to make it sound like they had some kind of intimate relationship. I showed Austin and watched his face go white. He immediately called Detective Palermo, and she told him to send her the link right away. She said this was evidence of ongoing harassment and defamation, that she'd document it for our legal case. The detective's voice was grim as she explained that manipulating recordings like this could actually help our case because it showed Catelyn was still actively working to create a false narrative about their relationship. That night, I couldn't sleep, staring at my phone and scrolling through the comments on Catelyn's post, where strangers were calling me selfish and cruel. Austin came home around 11, smelling like hospital soap again, and I just snapped. I got up from the couch and walked straight to our bedroom, pulled my old duffel bag from the closet, and started throwing clothes into it. Austin followed me and stood in the doorway looking confused. He asked what I was doing, and I told him I couldn't do this anymore, that I was tired of coming second to his guilt over someone who stalked us. He stepped into the room and reached for my arm, but I pulled away, shoving more shirts into the bag. He started crying and said he knew he'd been a terrible partner, that the guilt was eating him alive and he didn't know how to fix it. I stopped packing and turned around, seeing him completely broken down, and something in me softened just enough to suggest therapy instead of leaving. He nodded immediately and said he'd call someone first thing in the morning, that he'd do whatever it took. I left the bag half-packed on the floor as a reminder of how close we came to ending everything. 2 days later, we sat in a small office with beige walls and a therapist Imogen had recommended, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes who didn't waste time on small talk. She asked us both to explain why we were there, and I went first, describing the stalking and the crash, and how Austin had basically moved into the hospital. Austin talked about waking up every morning seeing Catelyn's car flip across the highway, how it played on repeat in his head. The therapist asked Austin about his family, and he got quiet before explaining that his mom had been sick his whole childhood, in and out of hospitals with a chronic condition, and he'd spent years feeling responsible for her pain. He said watching someone suffer because of something connected to him brought all that guilt rushing back. I shared how Catelyn's stalking had triggered my hypervigilance from a previous relationship, where my ex had tracked my movements and shown up at my work unannounced. The therapist listened carefully, and then explained how our individual trauma responses were colliding, making everything worse. She said Austin was repeating a childhood pattern of trying to fix someone else's suffering, and I was stuck in a fear response that made me see abandonment everywhere. Neither of us had realized how much our pasts were controlling our reactions. The court date for our protective order arrived 3 weeks later, and I put on the most professional outfit I owned, a navy dress that felt too formal for my normal life. Maddie met us outside the courthouse with a thick folder of evidence, including my timeline of stalking incidents, security footage from our old apartment, witness statements from neighbors, and printed screenshots of Catelyn's social media posts. Inside the courtroom, I saw my aunt sitting in the back row with her arms crossed and my stomach dropped. The judge called our case, and Maddie stood up to present everything we'd documented, walking through each incident methodically. She showed the footage of Catelyn trying our door at 2 in the morning, the photos of her following us to different locations, the edited audio clips she'd posted online. My aunt tried to interrupt twice to defend Catelyn, but the judge told her she'd have a chance to speak later. Then Maddie pulled out written statements from 2 of my cousins, including Miguel, explaining that they'd witnessed Catelyn's behavior escalate over months and supported our need for legal protection. Reading those statements made my eyes water because I'd felt so alone in this, and knowing some family members actually saw the truth meant everything. After the court hearing, I spent 4 days at our kitchen table writing my impact statement, trying to put into words how the stalking had destroyed my sense of safety. I wrote about checking every car behind us on the highway, about not being able to sleep through the night anymore, about the panic attacks that hit me in random moments. I described how opening my front door made my heart race because I never knew if Catelyn would be standing there. I wrote about watching my relationship fall apart as Austin got consumed by guilt, about feeling like I was losing him to the person who'd terrorized us. Reading back through what I'd written made me cry because seeing it all laid out showed me just how much trauma I'd been carrying around. I realized that asking for legal protection wasn't mean or cruel. It was the only way to start healing. The process hurt, but it also made everything clear in a way nothing else had. Austin worked on his own letter to Catelyn during those same days, sitting at his laptop for hours trying to find the right words. Kalani had agreed to deliver it through official hospital channels, so it wouldn't violate any boundaries. He read me the final version before sending it, and his hands shook holding the printed pages. The letter said he genuinely cared about her well-being and hoped she got better, but that he couldn't be part of her recovery process anymore. He explained that his involvement wasn't healthy for anyone, and that she needed to work with her actual care team instead of relying on him. The tone was kind but completely firm, setting clear limits without attacking her. After he sent it through Kalani, Austin seemed different, like he'd been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. His shoulders looked less tense and he slept better that night than he had in weeks. The judge granted our protective order 2 weeks after the hearing, issuing a 1-year no-contact restriction that prohibited Catelyn from reaching out to us directly, posting about us on social media, or coming within 500 feet of our home or workplaces. The order included special provisions that could modify the terms if Catelyn's behavior escalated or if we needed additional protection. Maddie called to tell us the news, and I actually felt my body relax for the first time in months. Walking out of the courthouse after picking up the official paperwork, Austin pulled me into a hug that lasted a full minute, and I realized it was the first real hug we'd shared in weeks. We stood there on the courthouse steps holding each other while people walked past, both of us feeling cautiously hopeful that maybe we could actually start rebuilding now. The family reaction came fast and brutal, with my aunt posting on social media that same evening about heartless relatives who kick people when they're down. She didn't name us directly, but everyone knew exactly who she meant, and the comments filled up with relatives taking sides. But then my phone started buzzing with private messages from 3 cousins, including Miguel, who apologized for not recognizing the stalking pattern earlier. They said they'd been so focused on Catelyn's paralysis that they hadn't really thought about what led to the crash. Miguel admitted he felt guilty for not speaking up sooner when he saw how obsessed she was getting. My parents sent a careful text message saying they supported our need for boundaries, even though they felt sad about the family division, which wasn't perfect, but was more than I'd expected from them. Austin scheduled a meeting with Kalani to figure out how to step back from visiting Catelyn without just abandoning her completely. Kalani explained that the hospital had a volunteer network specifically for patients without family support, people trained to provide companionship during recovery. Austin spent an afternoon writing a detailed letter for the volunteer coordinator, describing Catelyn's interests, her personality, things that helped calm her down during difficult moments. He included information about her favorite music and TV shows, the kinds of conversations she responded well to. Handing over that letter felt like officially closing a chapter, and Austin admitted it was harder than he'd expected. But he also recognized that letting go was necessary for everyone's health, that his guilt-driven involvement had been hurting all 3 of us. Over the next few weeks, our home routines slowly found a new rhythm, with Austin coming home at consistent times instead of disappearing to the hospital. We started cooking dinner together most nights, something we hadn't done since before the anniversary dinner that started everything. I made spaghetti while he chopped vegetables, and we talked about normal things like what to watch on TV or whether we needed to buy new towels. My anxiety didn't magically disappear, but I started sleeping better, getting through most nights without waking up in a panic. We both kept going to individual therapy and scheduled couples sessions every other week, doing the actual work of rebuilding trust instead of just hoping things would fix themselves. It felt fragile and tentative, but also real in a way our relationship hadn't been for months. Then one afternoon, someone knocked on our door and I opened it to find a mutual friend holding a large gift basket wrapped in cellophane. She smiled and said it was from Catelyn, that she'd asked her to deliver it as a peace offering. My stomach dropped as I took the basket and saw a card attached with Catelyn's handwriting. Austin came to the door and immediately pulled out his phone to photograph the basket, the card, and our friend still standing there looking confused. I thanked her and closed the door, then called Detective Palermo right away to report the violation. The detective said she'd follow up with our friend to document how the delivery happened and confirm Catelyn had initiated the contact. Maddie sent a formal warning letter to Catelyn's attorney that same day, reminding them that any contact violated the court order and future violations could result in legal consequences. The gift basket sat on our counter untouched, a reminder that even with legal protection in place, we still had to stay alert. Miguel called me 2 days later and asked if we could meet for coffee because he had something to tell me about the family situation. We met at a place near his work, and he looked uncomfortable as he stirred his drink. He said my aunt had called her credit card company and started a chargeback for the $2,000 she paid Harlow the psychic. Apparently, the aunt was claiming the readings were fraudulent and manipulative, which meant she was finally admitting the whole cosmic destiny thing was fake. Miguel said she'd been avoiding Harlow's calls and deleted all the psychic's contact information from her phone. This didn't fix everything that had happened or erase the months of enabling Catelyn's delusion, but it showed my aunt was starting to recognize her role in the mess. I thanked Miguel for telling me and asked him not to mention our conversation to anyone else in the family. A week after that conversation, Austin came home from work with the biggest smile I'd seen in months. He dropped his bag by the door and told me Lars had called him into the office for his performance improvement plan review. Austin said Lars told him his recent work had been excellent, and he was officially back in good standing with the company. The relief on Austin's face was visible, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks and could finally exhale. He came home energized instead of drained that night, and we ordered takeout to celebrate the small victory. The job security helped both of us breathe easier about our financial situation, since we'd been burning through savings on legal fees and therapy. My mom called the following week and invited us to dinner at their house with just her, my dad, and Miguel. She made it clear up front that Catelyn and my aunt wouldn't be discussed during the meal, and everyone needed to respect that boundary. Austin and I talked about whether to go, worried it might be awkward or turn into another guilt trip. But we decided to try because completely cutting off my parents felt too extreme. The dinner was polite but definitely strained, with everyone carefully avoiding certain topics. My dad asked about Austin's job, and my mom talked about their garden, safe subjects that didn't lead to family drama. Miguel helped keep conversation flowing by telling stories about his kids. It wasn't perfect, and the elephant in the room was obvious, but it was better than the complete distance we'd been living with. Driving home that night, Austin said it felt like a tentative first step toward having some kind of relationship with my family again. Kalani called a few days later with an update about Catelyn's progress at the rehabilitation facility. She said Catelyn had started working with a psychologist as part of her treatment program and was making progress on accepting reality-based thinking. The social worker emphasized this was early progress and setbacks were likely, but Catelyn was actually engaging with therapy instead of refusing help. Kalani said the psychologist was helping Catelyn process her obsession and understand how the psychic readings had fed into unhealthy patterns. I felt cautiously hopeful hearing this, thinking maybe Catelyn could eventually move past the delusion and build a real life for herself. But I also knew one phone call about therapy didn't erase months of stalking and harassment. Maddie contacted us the next week with official notice that Catelyn was planning to move to an accessible housing facility about an hour away. The new place was closer to specialized rehabilitation services and had better support systems for people with spinal injuries. The distance felt like a relief because it reduced the chance of accidentally running into her at a store or restaurant. Maddie said my aunt was apparently helping coordinate the move and handling the logistics, which suggested she was finally prioritizing Catelyn's actual needs over the cosmic destiny fantasy. Austin and I sat down that weekend for a serious conversation about our relationship and what we wanted for the future. We both agreed we weren't ready for engagement or major commitments yet after everything we'd been through. Instead, we decided to keep going to therapy and focus on rebuilding our foundation before making any big decisions. This felt mature and honest rather than romantic, but it was what we needed right now. Austin admitted he still struggled with guilt about Catelyn's paralysis, even though he understood logically it wasn't his fault. I told him I still had anxiety about being blamed by my family and worried about future harassment. We agreed to take things month by month and not rush into anything just because we thought we should. Detective Palermo called to let us know she was closing the active investigation since the protective order was in place and Catelyn had moved to the facility. But she provided us with a detailed safety plan for if harassment started again. The detective emphasized that the order remained fully enforceable, and we should document any violations immediately with photos, screenshots, and detailed notes. She gave us her direct number and said to call if anything concerning happened. Having clear next steps helped me feel less helpless, like we had a plan instead of just reacting to whatever Catelyn did next. Over the following weeks, I noticed Catelyn's GoFundMe posts gradually changing tone. She stopped posting about soulmates and cosmic destiny and started focusing on rehabilitation progress and accessibility advocacy. The posts showed her working with physical therapists and talking about adapting to life in a wheelchair. The comment section shifted too, with fewer people attacking me and more people offering genuine support for her recovery. The online harassment directed at me died down as the story lost its dramatic angle. I cautiously started re-engaging with social media using strict privacy settings and limiting who could see my posts. I slowly expanded my presence again over the next month, sharing normal life updates about cooking dinner or watching shows. Several friends reached out privately saying they never believed the online narrative about me, and were glad I was back. One friend admitted she'd wanted to reach out during the worst of it, but didn't know what to say. Rebuilding these connections helped me feel less isolated and more like myself again, instead of just the villain in Catelyn's story. Then one afternoon, my aunt sent me a brief text message. It said she was sorry for getting caught up in the psychic stuff, and acknowledged she should have stopped Catelyn earlier. The apology was limited and didn't address everything she'd said or done, but it represented a shift from blame to accountability. She didn't make excuses or try to justify her actions, just admitted she'd made mistakes. I stared at the message for a long time before responding with a simple thank you. I wasn't ready for full reconciliation or long conversations about the past, but I appreciated the gesture. Austin read the text when I showed him and said it was more than he expected from her. A few weeks later, Kaylani called to schedule Austin's final visit before Catelyn transferred to the new facility an hour away. She explained that the volunteer network was ready to take over regular visiting duties, and this goodbye would help everyone move forward. Austin looked nervous when I drove him to the hospital that afternoon, his hands shaking slightly as we walked through the parking lot. Kaylani met us in the lobby and walked with Austin to Catelyn's room while I waited in the family area, staring at my phone and trying not to imagine what they were saying. He came back 40 minutes later looking completely drained, his eyes red but his shoulders somehow lighter. On the drive home, he told me the goodbye felt like closing a door that had been stuck open for months, and even though it was hard, it was also necessary. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. out of habit, expecting to find his side of the bed empty like so many nights before. But he was there, sleeping deeply without the twitching and mumbling that had become normal. I watched him breathe steadily for a few minutes, realizing this was the first time in months he'd slept through the night without nightmares waking him up. I woke up one random Tuesday morning and checked my phone to see it was almost 9, which meant I'd slept for 8 hours straight without anxiety jerking me awake. The realization hit me so hard that I started crying right there in bed. Not sad tears, but this overwhelming wave of relief that I could finally rest without my brain screaming danger every few hours. Austin found me in the kitchen a few minutes later, still wiping my eyes, and when I tried to explain what was happening, he just pulled me into a hug and held me while I cried into his shirt. We had a therapy session with Imogen that afternoon, and when I told her about sleeping through the night, she smiled and said that feeling safe enough to sleep deeply was a major step in trauma recovery. She explained that my nervous system was finally starting to believe the danger had passed, which sounded simple but felt huge after months of barely sleeping. We decided to plan a weekend camping trip to a state park about 2 hours away, something normal that couples do without restraining orders and family drama hanging over them. Before we left, I sent clear messages to my parents and Austin's boss saying we'd be completely unreachable for 3 days. No exceptions. We sat at our kitchen table the night before and reviewed our safety plan one more time, checking that the protective order was active and would remain in effect while we were gone. Austin pulled up the state park website and showed me pictures of the hiking trails and lake, and I felt this weird flutter of excitement that I hadn't felt since our anniversary dinner almost a year ago. Packing our camping gear felt significant somehow, like we were finally doing something for ourselves instead of just reacting to whatever crisis came next. Maddie called a few weeks after the camping trip to say that Catelyn's legal representative had sent formal paperwork acknowledging the no-contact order. The letter confirmed that Catelyn was committed to ongoing therapy at her new facility and recognized the boundaries we'd set. I read through the legal language twice, looking for some hidden meaning or loophole, but it seemed straightforward and official. The letter didn't include an apology or take responsibility for the stalking, but it did show that Catelyn understood the order was real and permanent. Reading it made me feel this unexpected wave of empathy for her, mixed with relief that she was actually getting professional help instead of chasing cosmic destiny readings. Several quiet months passed after that with no violations, no midnight calls from family members, and no social media drama. Austin and I settled into routines that felt sustainable instead of exhausting, with regular work schedules, weekly therapy sessions, and normal couple activities like cooking dinner together and watching shows. The protective order stayed in place without any challenges. Catelyn continued her rehabilitation program, according to updates Miguel shared occasionally, and my aunt kept her distance except for brief, polite texts on holidays. My anxiety didn't disappear completely, but I stopped checking the locks 5 times before bed and could go to the grocery store without scanning every parking lot for Catelyn's car. Life started feeling almost normal again, though both Austin and I knew we were different people now than we'd been at that anniversary dinner. We'd survived something that could have destroyed us completely, and even though we weren't perfect, we were still here and still trying. Sitting on our couch 9 months after the highway crash, Austin and I talked about everything that had happened since Catelyn showed up screaming about cosmic destiny at our anniversary dinner. We weren't the same people anymore, and our relationship wasn't the easy, comfortable thing it used to be, but we were both healthier and more honest than before. Catelyn was getting real professional help instead of spending thousands of dollars on psychic readings. My family was slowly learning about boundaries and accountability, and we'd figured out that protecting yourself isn't cruel or selfish but actually necessary for survival. The whole mess hadn't disappeared or been magically fixed, and we still had hard days where the trauma felt fresh, but everyone involved was on a clearer and better path forward than where we'd started. Austin reached over and took my hand, and I squeezed back, both of us understanding without saying anything that we'd made it through something terrible and come out the other side still together. That felt like enough for now, and maybe that was the point all along, that surviving and healing was its own kind of victory, even without a perfect happy ending. So yeah, that's basically it. Nothing too deep, just another weird little story that stuck with me. Thanks for hanging out. It always feels like talking to a friend. Come back next time if you're up for it.